So first, I just want to say thank you all for being here and for this opportunity to share our story. I'm going to speak for a little with some pictures and videos, and then I would really love to open it up if you have some questions. Because for me, this is about telling a story, talking about the resilience of my great niece and so many other people, and about hope. But it's also a conversation. So I'm just going to start with saying that yes, I did live in Israel for many years. I raised my kids there. I had moved back to the States in 2001. My father was quite ill. And then I stayed in America, in Los Angeles at that time, raising my kids there, but going back and forth to Israel a few times because my husband and I, my then husband and I, we built a shopping center in Israel. Company, and for us it was always about two countries. And to this day I have two kids that are Israelis. I have three kids that are not Israelis but speak Hebrew fluently. Our family is there, and so for myself and for my entire family, being part of Israel, Israeli, Jewish people, has been something that's so important, and as David mentioned, my parents' work when I was growing up. So I want to say thank you because I know in this room and in so many places there are so many people that do support Israel and support the Jewish people. But what I do know, and we'll talk about that, is that there are less people that are anti-Israel than there are pro. Less people that are anti-Jews that are pro, but they are loud. And one of the things that I really work on is telling the truth and the stories so that I give people like yourselves to bear witness and then to be spokespeople for the Jews and for Israel and telling the true story of October 7th. Now, my story is that I was in New York and I was coming to visit my daughter who was living in Jaffa at that moment. On October 5th, I got on a plane and I ran into a senator, a friend of mine who was a senator of New Jersey. His name is Cory Booker. And he was on the plane and he said, what are you doing when you get to Israel? And I said, well, I'm going to go to Tel Aviv. I'm going to see my daughter in the morning. And he said, no, come with us. It's Simchat Torah, the evening of Simchat Torah. And he said, and we're going to go to Shul and dance with the Torah, then go to dinner with an American-Israeli family. And then I said, of course. My daughter was busy that evening. So instead of going from the airport to Tel Aviv, I went to Yerushalayim, and it was magical. It was this beautiful evening where people were dressed and people were walking the streets and they were religious and they were secular, but they were all out there celebrating this beautiful evening. And then I go and I get to this shul. It's an Orthodox shul. And the women and the men are separated, but we are dancing with the Torah, and people are just happy. And it is a beautiful evening, and then we go to a dinner with this family, 30 people, children, grandchildren, and it is beautiful and magical. Then the next morning, that evening, I go back to Tel Aviv, and I'm going to see my daughter and my family for breakfast, and at 6:30 in the morning, the sirens ring. Sirens blare in my hotel, and I find myself going back and forth for about an hour to and from my room to the stairwell, which was the safe space in this hotel in Tel Aviv. Now I'm going to show you a video, and then I'm going to talk about what happened that morning. If you could choose the first video, please. And just look at the little characters in it. Abigail. Thanks. So this is my family. These are my great nieces and nephews, and you heard the name Abigail, which is Abigail, and Inbar, who's another one of my nephews. And this was where they grew up. This was their kibbutz called Kfar Aza. Now, I'd spent many, many times over 25, 30 years at this kibbutz along the border with Gaza. So I was very familiar with where it was located, but I was mostly familiar with what the quality of life is for all of these people. So that morning at 6:30, the alarm started blaring, going back and forth. Around 7:30, we started to understand something else was happening in Israel. And we learned that there was an invasion. And so I called my family, my sister-in-law Shlomit, I called my niece Liron. At this kibbutz, no one answers the phone. But what I understood was that something was happening. So I called my sister-in-law in Tel Aviv and I said, what is happening? And the first thing she said to me was that at 6:30 in the morning, the Hamas terrorists had entered into their home and murdered my niece Madar, her husband Ro'i, and their baby girl, a 3-year-old Abigail. So this is what I was hearing in this hotel room, in this safe space. I couldn't go visit my daughter. No one was going anywhere. And think about this. As we are hearing this, missiles are flying all over Israel. So this was a complete attack. And then there was this physical attack on the kibbutz, and as we learned, all through the southern region of Israel. What we then learned was from a 6- and 9-year-old, my niece and my nephew, they were in that video, running. They were in a closet, locked in a closet in their home, in a dark closet, and their mother's body was laying next to them. And what they told us was that that morning at 6:30, when the sirens began, and they lived along the border, so when there were sirens, they put their kids in very quickly. They did not have time. And what they said was that at 6:30 that morning, terrorists entered their home and killed Smadar, my niece, in front of a 3, and a 6, and a 9-year-old. Now their father, who was a photojournalist, Ro'i, he had done this many times, which was he had worked for Ynet, which is a news agency in Israel, and he had gone outside to take photos, which is what he had done on, unfortunately, many occasions, because as we all know, Israel is a country that has been bombed, and that people generally run to their safe rooms, and then they start their day again. But on this morning when he went, he actually took pictures of paragliders, terrorists on paraglides coming into their community. He realized it was a terror attack. He runs home. He picks up the little 3-year-old, and then he starts to run. If you'll just do the next picture, please. So that's Ro'i, and that's my niece Madar, and the little girl in the blonde is Amalia, and the little boy is Michael, and that's Abigail. Ro'i picks up Abigail and they start to run. And the 4 people are running, and Ro'i is gunned down and murdered by Hamas terrorists. He falls onto Abigail, and Michael and Amalia, they run home, they lock themselves in a closet, and they are our only voices that morning. They are the 2 little kids telling us what had happened. Now, they were in that closet for 14 hours. There was no IDF to rescue them. My niece and her husband, another niece and her husband who lived on the kibbutz with their 3 kids, they spent 28 hours in a safe room on the other side of the kibbutz. They knew what happened, but they also knew that if they went out, that they would be killed. They stayed quiet in their home, and during the day and during the evening, smelled smoke. Terrorists were in their home. They were hiding. Early that morning, my nephew had seen a woman they knew, a young woman with a baby, a 1-month-old baby, and had grabbed her and taken her into the house, as terrorists are everywhere. On this kibbutz, there were over 300 terrorists, with about 700 people lived. Everyone cowering, Jewish people cowering for their lives. This woman and her infant had just experienced the murder of this woman's husband. They were there, 5 of them, for over 28 hours before the IDF could rescue them and take them to safety. My sister-in-law, Shlomit, was on a trip to Bulgaria with a kibbutz group, her husband, Eitan, an older elderly gentleman, alone in his safe room. While this was happening, my entire family knew what was going on, but no one could go and rescue Michael and Amalia. So they were taken off after 14 hours. My other family was taken off after 29 hours. And what we learned and what we knew was that these 3 people had been murdered. But there was so much going on this kibbutz that nobody could get there to actually see what was happening for a few days. There were so many terrorists. There were reservists that came on their own to help support the kibbutz and fight for them, young men who had left the army. They were murdered, they were injured. By the time the army came and figured out and cleaned up just this one community, after a few days, Abigail, this beautiful little 3-year-old, was nowhere to be found. What we learned, if you'll go to the next photo, was that this little girl, Abigail, 3 years old, had actually survived the murder of her father in his arms. And she had crawled out from under his body, covered in his blood, and run to a neighbor. Now imagine this, you saw the beautiful green neighborhood. There were over 300 terrorists, many of them dressed in like they were IDF fighters. Abigail was running to a house. No one answered the door. Everyone was hiding. This little 3-year-old then went to another house, her father's best friend. She went to school with the little boy. And by a miracle, this man, whose name is Abigail, was actually going out dressed in an IDF fatigue to go and protect the kibbutz. He was one of 14 members of the kibbutz's defense. Now on this kibbutz, many years back, or for many years, they had their armory with them in the homes. A couple years back, the government said you have to put them in a safe space. He had to go across the kibbutz to go get his weaponry. He opens the door, and there he sees this little child, white face, but covered in her father's blood. And he knows who she is. But this child looks at him and runs. Why does she run? Because he is dressed as the men who just murdered her mother and her father. He grabs her, and she does know who he is. And he puts her in the safe room with his wife and his 3 kids. And then he goes out to protect the kibbutz. His wife understands that's his job. But what they didn't understand was the amount of people, the amount of terrorists, Hamas terrorists that were on the kibbutz that morning. And what we didn't understand, they didn't understand, was that they came so well prepared to murder and to destroy. He had been injured, and he didn't come back. But he was taken off the kibbutz, airlifted out, and a few days later what he did was tell us that Abigail had indeed gotten to his house, and that he had actually put her in the safe room with his wife and 3 kids. But then we also learned that a few hours at 11:30 that morning, people on the kibbutz had seen his wife and the 3 kids being marched off the kibbutz by Hamas terrorists. We didn't know for sure if Abigail was with them, but Abigail was nowhere to be found. So we began to assume that Abigail was one of the children, and they just didn't see that there was a 4th child. Now, these are people like in our neighborhood, so we know them. And so they looked and they saw this woman being marched off with her kids. And what we then put together was that Abigail was a hostage. Now, I returned back to America, and I became what's known as a hostage advocate. And about a week later, as I knew that Abigail was a hostage, I went to Washington, D.C. Now, I went before anybody from Israel got there. I was an American. I was back in America. I understood that we needed to go and tell this story. I mean, from that first night in that hotel room, people were calling me, and I was sharing the story because what I understood is that we needed to tell people what was happening in real time. Because as we know, the Hamas terrorists had GoPro cameras. They videoed it all. They showed the world. But at the same time, there were people in our world, here in America, all over, that were denying it happened, saying that they didn't really happen. But what I understood was it happened to my family. And at that moment, my niece and her husband were murdered, and their 3-year-old child was taken as a hostage with 250 other people. And of those 250 people, there were 35 that were under the age of 18, babies, little kids, teenagers. But what I understood was when I went to tell people what happened, was that I needed to show them a picture. So I took this picture that was taken just a couple months before, and I looked at this picture and I saw in her eyes, and if you see them in these dark brown, beautiful eyes, I looked at those eyes and I said, I'm going to rescue you. Now, I had no idea what that meant, but I knew that there was something that we could do. My family in Israel was waiting to bury her parents. They were all just trying to get through each day. And for me, it was about, okay, this is what I'm going to do, which is I'm going to go and try to fight for Abigail. So I go to Washington, D.C., and it was myself and the sister of Keith Siegel, who many of you know the name. He was released back around the 500 days, 600 days, excuse me. But, 500 days. But I went with his sister, and we basically, they're from North Carolina, and we went and we talked to Democrats, we talked to Republicans, we talked to people on the left, we talked to people on the right. We talked to anyone, and I showed them this picture, which I made hundreds of copies of, and I gave it to them. I also gave them a picture that had the mosaic of all 250 hostages, because what I knew was that people had to understand these were real people. These were people like all of us sitting here today. These weren't just others. And as David mentioned, these were people from over 30 nations. There were young men from Africa who had just come to learn about farming. There were Nepalese and Filipino workers that both worked on the kibbutzes and in the farms, but also took care of the elderly. There were people who were Muslim, Bedouins that were kidnapped and murdered on October 7th, Christians, Jews, people from many different parts of our world. They happened to be in Israel. And that is why, for me, I always talk about this as a humanitarian crisis. While this is against the Jewish people, this is really against all people. So I go there and I start talking and I start telling the story. And one of the things that I understood was that when people saw this picture of this child, they all were crying. She was a hostage. We had no idea if she was going to get out. We had no idea what was going on, because now, as I sit here at 600 and almost 40 days, we have had no international health organization visit these people. And as I speak today, there are 50 hostages, 20 to 22 we know are alive. But those are from propaganda videos from Hamas. Those are from people that were released talking about having spent time with them in the dark tunnels of Gaza. I still get the chills when I talk about this, because for me, these 22 young men need to all come home. They're our family. The other 30 who were killed, and 2 are American young boys, 21 now, and 23, they need to come home. They need to be buried. They need to have their parents have closure and to have dignity of a proper burial. So while I'm here today, there's 50 people that are being held hostage, 22 are alive, and there is a deal. And we keep hoping that this will be that deal that will happen. Going back to Abigail, if you'll go to the next picture, please. Abigail was released after 51 days. I write about it in a book that's called Saving Abigail, what her 51 days are like, and you can read it and learn. But on the 51st day, Abigail was released. She was released on the 3rd day of a hostage deal that was led by President Joe Biden, brokered by the Qataris, and that Israel and Hamas, both at that moment, were willing to make a deal. And that deal broke down after less than a week. And there were 105 women and children and foreign workers who were released in that deal. Abigail, thankfully, was one of them. Because if she wasn't released at that deal, I don't know if she would be alive today. After that deal broke down, I kept in the fight, because I looked at this now as not about just Liz's family. I told you on that first day I took a picture of the 250 people. But what happened over those few months, was that we all became this family. And what I understood was that this family was bigger than a Jewish family. This family was bigger than a Christian and Jewish family. This was a world family. And these were people whose family members were still being held in Gaza. So we kept going back and forth to Washington, D.C., meeting with leaders on the Democratic and the Republican side. People were traveling internationally. I was one of 12 of families that went and met with President Biden, Vice President Harris, and at that time, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Special Envoy Brett McGurk, Secretary of State Blinken. I mean, we were just having these meetings because what we understood was we had to keep this top in the interest of everyone, because there's so much news, we all know it. But we wanted to make sure that they all knew that the hostages were a priority. And as many of you know, that in Israel they had the Hostage Family Forum, and that was really important and it still is important because it brings the news in Israel. But what I understood was, in order to get to Americans, and it is the Americans that have led the efforts. Other countries have been supportive. In my opinion, not enough. But I do believe, and this is something I talk about, which is I am so grateful that the American government, Democrats and Republicans, people far left, people far right, for the majority have stayed together for Israel, for the hostages, and on the subject of anti-Semitism. So I talk about President Biden because if it were not for him, I do not believe Abigail would be released. But there was a deal that was being presented all during 2024 that he could not get over the finish line with Prime Minister Netanyahu and with Hamas. And then Trump came in, President Trump came in, and he was able to get that deal done. But keep in mind that for the last 2 months before President Biden was finishing and Trump was coming in, this was one place where these two administrations worked together. And the meetings were happening between the former administration and Steve Witkoff, who was coming in, and Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, all the people that were coming in on the Trump team. And they were working together so that on January 20th, after the inauguration, that the Trump team was up to speed. And as we saw even before that, we had a few women who were released on the 19th of January. And then we had 33 people released. And then again, it stopped. And then we saw a few weeks ago, Edon Alexander, an American citizen, 21-year-old boy, grew up in New Jersey. He was released. And he just went to the White House yesterday and met with President Trump, which was amazing. Because this is a young kid, he could have been my son. But now we still have, you know what, let's go to the next photo. I keep talking. I want to take a step back. After Abigail was released, I went to the kibbutz. And on the kibbutz, this is what I found. This was one of the bed houses. This was a typical house that was burned and destroyed. And I show this because I need people to understand the human toll, but also the physical toll of what they did. Next photo, please. And then this is me standing in the kitchen of my niece's home. And you can see the furniture overturned, and you can see the mess and the dirt. And this was only 2 months after. But what you also see is that it was a normal Shabbat Saturday morning. The dishes in the sink, people were starting their day. It was a holiday, it was a Saturday, it was a beautiful Saturday. And I show this because this is what they did to these homes. Next photo, please. On December 13th, after Abigail was released, I went with the other hostage families, the Americans, to the White House. We met with President Biden, and he sat and he listened to each and every one of the stories. Afterwards, we did a press conference. And if you look here, you see family members whose loved ones have come home. But on the far right, you see Ruby Chen and Ronen Nutra, and those are the two fathers of American boys that are still there. At that moment, they thought their boys might be alive. They had intelligence over the last year that found out that they had both been murdered on October 7th. These men and their wives are still fighting for their loved ones, their children, for all of them. And even yesterday, 4th of July in America, they made another appeal. Please help us bring home our kids. While it is the 4th of July, we are celebrating freedom. Our boys are not free. So I show this picture because we have had the support of the American government. And I know that we still have the support of the American government and the White House. Next photo, please. So my niece, Liron, and her husband, Zoli, who had 3 kids, now have 6 kids. We talked about how many kids everyone has. They went from 3 to 6. And one of the things I spend a lot of time doing is spending time with the family and going to Israel and just being there with these 6 beautiful children. But for my niece and my nephew, my niece lost her best friend, her little sister. Every day is a struggle. Now, the kids go to school, and the kids are being given an opportunity for a normal life. But people say, what is normal? Normal is that they go to school, and they play, and they have friends. But normal is also for them what happened on October 7th for all 6 of these kids, all 6 of them. But I show this because they came to New York, and it was just important for them to start to have life again and to make new memories. And I say that word memories because you think about the people that are still there as hostages. Those families haven't been able to move forward. And I say that Israel and all of us have not been able to really move forward because we're still waiting for our loved ones to return. Next photo, please. So in April of 2024, we went to the White House. And this picture just sort of sums it up, which is the President of the United States taking the time to be with this family and listening to their struggle and offering them words, and at that time still fully 100% dedicated not only to bringing home the hostages, but for the support of Israel. And at this point, I don't think we'd ever had a president that declared, I am a Zionist, a US president. But this is what President Biden had done. And to the last moment, I do believe one of his greatest regrets in his presidency was not to bring home all these hostages. He really took this very seriously. But he told American families a few weeks before the inauguration of President Trump, go work with the Trump team. We have to get your people home. So this is the kind of leader he was. In this picture, you see little Abigail. She didn't really know what he was, who he was. But what you saw was that she understood that she was now in this place and she was safe. Next photo, please. I also met with Prime Minister Netanyahu because President Biden invited the American families and other families of hostages to come to Washington, D.C. And this was a meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And one of the things that I said and many of the families said was, and this was in July of 2024, do everything you can to bring home these hostages. And of course, yes, he had to fight Hamas, but what we said was that this was a humanitarian crisis. Hamas is a very challenging group that has to be removed, that cannot stay, but that our loved ones every day was urgent. Every day was a day that they could be killed, or they could starve, or they would never come home again. Next photo. And this was a meeting at the White House that President Biden invited us, just the American families, and to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu a few days later. And at this meeting, Prime Minister Netanyahu really declared to all of our families there was a deal. It was going to be able to be signed, and it was going to happen. But he went back to Israel, and it didn't happen. And in this picture, you see to the left the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, a young man who was at the Nova Music Festival, and he was taken. His arm was blown off by a grenade before he was taken hostage. A few days after this meeting, and when they did not get a deal, his son was murdered by terrorists. He and a handful of 5 beautiful young people. I show this photo not as a blame photo, but one of that we keep getting commitments and it doesn't get over and we don't get these hostages home. But that's where we all come in, which is to keep talking about them and not letting it just become yesterday's news, but making it tomorrow's and the next day's, and keeping the hope that they will all be home, because this is something that we all can do. We talk about what we can do. I can't go in and negotiate, but I can keep telling the story and making sure that I tell the story to people like yourselves and that you keep going and telling that story. Next photo, please. So just a quick picture. We, the hostage families, were invited to the inaugural parade right after the inauguration. And as you see, there's all of us in the yellow, David's yellow. And we basically were there. And what it said to me was that President Trump on day one, this was January 20th, 2024, was committed to bringing home the hostages. Next photo, please. And I just show this because, from when I speak in America, what I really want people to know, and I think it's important here, when people say, oh, our government's horrible, they're anti-Semitic, they're not. In our US government, we can have debate, but what I can tell you is that we have had support from Democrats and Republicans. And here you have former Speaker Nancy Pelosi and a congressman from California named Pete, and they came to a meeting with Abigail because they had helped bring Abigail home. And I wanted them to see Abigail. And so this was a photo of Abigail, my niece, and these 2 Democratic leaders. Next photo. And here the next day we were with Senator Susan Collins, a Republican from Maine, and Senator Capito Moore and from Virginia. And this is, again, 2 Republican women leaders. But for me, this was so important, and it keeps being important, because what I know for Israel is Israel must be supported by Christians and Jews. Israel must be supported by leaders that are left and right. And this is a message that what we all can try to keep in our minds and in our efforts is it cannot be a one-sided issue. If you love Israel, if you love the Jewish people, if you love humanity, we all have to work in this together. Next photo. So I'm going to end here, which is we still have 50 hostages. We still have a nation of traumatized children and adults. And one of the things I understand as Jewish community outside of Israel, the Christian community that cares, our hearts are tugged every day. We know that we're going to be getting 30 people back who were killed. We believe we're going to get 20 young men home. But until every one of those 50 are home, I will keep telling the story. I ask you to keep telling the story. Find ways to tell that story. I wrote a book called Saving Abigail, which is for sale here. And one of the reasons why this book to me is so important is because it tells a true story. And you can give this to people that are believers, non-believers, Christians, Jews. It doesn't matter. But what it matters is that this child, not unlike Anne Frank of the Holocaust, is a face that everyone got to know. And they got to know it because I got to Washington, D.C. and made sure that every leader had it. When I did CNN, BBC, MSNBC, Fox, I made sure everyone had this photo. And what I tell people is that this story is a true story. It is a story about why Israel is a Jewish homeland. It is a story about why Israel has to do everything it can to defend itself. But it's a story about these people who were murdered, those who were kidnapped. But it's a story about all of us, people in the Christian evangelical community in America that helped me from day one, the people in the Jewish community, the people in the political world. And so I come here and I say that for me, this is a book, if you know people that don't know the truth, or people in your churches, this is a book that they should read. It's not a book that's propaganda. It's really a painful book, but it's also a book of resilience and of hope. So for me, coming here today is just another opportunity to share our story. And I think we have a little time for some questions. Yeah, and really, if anything I leave for you today is thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I don't want this to be a sad message. I want this to be a message of inspiration. It is a horrible thing that we are living through. It is a horrible thing that happened. But we all can use that darkness to find some inspiration and use the light that we all carry. And I always say we have to pray, but we also have to use our voices in our communities. And when people aren't talking about the hostages until they're all home, talk about the hostages. Talk about the boys that are still there, that are alive. And even, I sometimes feel badly we don't talk about my niece and her husband who were 2 of 1,200 murdered that morning. When I have an opportunity, I do. But right now, what I need people to know and to focus on is those 50 people. So I'm happy to answer some questions. And again, I just have a great gratitude because I feel a lot of love in this room and appreciation. And I hope that I can just express to you how much that it means to me. So thank you.